Imagine a world 3,000 years ago, far more connected and advanced than most people realize. This wasn't some primitive, isolated time. This was the Late Bronze Age, a period that shimmered with innovation, vast empires, and a globalized economy. Picture it. Mighty pharaohs ruling Egypt, their monuments touching the sky. In Greece, the Mycenaeans built grand palaces like Mycenaean palace, their wealth evident in every artifact. Further east, the powerful Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia, a rival to Egypt for regional supremacy. Then there was Assyria, Babylon, and the bustling port city of Ugarit, each a jewel in a crown of interconnected civilizations. This wasn't just a collection of powerful states, it was a true international system. Think of it like an ancient version of our modern world, but with chariots instead of cars and cuneiform tablets instead of emails. Trade routes stretched across continents, buzzing with activity. Essential resources like tin, crucial for making bronze, traveled all the way from distant lands like Afghanistan and even parts of Europe, making its way to workshops in the Near East. Copper, another vital component, was primarily sourced from Cyprus, an island whose very name became synonymous with the metal. But it wasn't just raw materials moving around. Luxury goods, gold, silver, exquisite pottery, rare woods and precious stones flowed between these empires, symbols of status and power. More importantly, ideas, technologies, and artistic styles also crisscrossed these routes, fostering a shared culture among the elite. Technology during this era was nothing short of remarkable. The ability to smelt copper and tin together to create bronze was a revolutionary leap. Bronze was harder, more durable, and held a sharper edge than pure copper, transforming warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship. This sophisticated metallurgy allowed for the creation of intricate tools, weapons, and stunning works of art. Beyond metalwork, these civilizations boasted monumental architecture that still awes us today. The pyramids of Egypt, the massive walls of Mycenae, and the sprawling temples of the Hittites stand as testaments to their engineering prowess. And let's not forget their writing systems. In Mycenaean Greece, they used Linear B, a script for recording administrative details. In Mesopotamia and parts of the Near East, cuneiform, pressed into clay tablets, served as the universal script for diplomacy, law, and literature. These were complex societies, built on knowledge and intricate administration. The political landscape was a delicate dance between great powers. These empires recognized each other as equals, often addressing each other as brother in their diplomatic correspondence. A fascinating glimpse into this world comes from the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets found in Egypt. These letters reveal a complex web of treaties, alliances, and sometimes thinly veiled threats between pharaohs, Hittite kings, and Babylonian rulers. They wrote about trade disputes, requests for gold, marriage proposals, and military aid. It was a world of shifting allegiances, where peace was often maintained through a balance of power and carefully negotiated agreements. Beneath the grand pronouncements of kings and the busy trade routes, society was structured in a clear hierarchy. At the top were the kings, often seen as divine or divinely appointed, holding immense power. Alongside them, powerful priests managed religious rituals and vast temple estates. Scribes, the keepers of knowledge, held a crucial role, recording everything from grain harvests to international treaties. Artisans, skilled in their crafts, produced the bronze tools, pottery, and luxury items that defined the age. The vast majority of the population, however, were farmers, toiling in the fields to feed the empires, and at the very bottom were slaves, often war captives, who performed much of the heavy labor. It was a world of order, prosperity, and seemingly endless progress, a golden age built on intricate connections and a shared understanding of how things worked. This intricate web of civilization, strong and vibrant, felt like it would last forever. A permanent fixture in the history of humanity. But even the strongest foundations can develop cracks, often in places no one expects, and the whispers of trouble had already begun to circulate, subtle at first, then growing louder. But even the strongest foundations can develop cracks, often in places no one expects, and the whispers of trouble had already begun to circulate, subtle at first, then growing louder. These were the early signs of instability, small tremors before the earthquake. The first cracks in the foundation of this seemingly unshakable Bronze Age world were often hard to spot, hidden beneath the veneer of prosperity and power. One of the most significant, yet often overlooked factors was a series of climatic shifts. Evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and ancient lake sediments paints a picture of prolonged droughts and changes in rainfall patterns across the Near East and the Aegean. For societies heavily reliant on rain-fed agriculture, even a few seasons of poor harvest could spell disaster. Rivers like the Nile, crucial for Egyptian fertility, might have experienced lower flood levels, impacting the annual replenishment of fertile soil. In regions like Anatolia and the Levant, where irrigation systems were less developed, consistent rainfall was vital for growing staple crops like wheat and barley. When these rains failed, food production plummeted, leading to widespread famine and hardship. This wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event, but a slow, grinding pressure that eroded the resilience of these civilizations over decades. Compounding these environmental pressures were internal unrests that began to simmer beneath the surface. With food shortages came economic strain, and with economic strain, social tensions rose. Peasants, already at the bottom of the social ladder, bore the brunt of crop failures. They struggled to feed their families and meet the demands of their overlords. This often led to peasant revolts, desperate acts by desperate people. There are hints in surviving texts of slave uprisings as well, as those at the very bottom sought to escape their harsh conditions. Economic disparities, always present, became more pronounced during times of scarcity. The rich could hoard resources, while the poor starved, fueling resentment and instability within the great empires. These internal struggles weakened the central authorities, diverting resources and attention away from external threats. As the great powers grappled with these internal and environmental challenges, new, more aggressive entities began to emerge on the fringes of their influence. These were not established empires, but smaller, more mobile groups who saw opportunity in the weakening giants. We see references to groups like the Lycians and Luca peoples, often described as raiders from the Anatolian coast. They were not new, but their activities intensified, signaling a shift in the regional balance of power. The Proto-Philistines, ancestors of the later Philistines, were likely among these groups, perhaps migrating or expanding their territories in response to their own environmental or social pressures. These groups were not necessarily interested in building empires, but in taking what they needed, often through force. This rise of smaller, aggressive factions directly contributed to another growing problem: increased piracy and raiding. The meticulously maintained trade routes, once arteries of prosperity, became targets. Coastal communities, previously thriving hubs of commerce, found themselves under constant threat. Ships laden with copper, tin, grain, and luxury goods became prizes for raiders. This disruption of trade had a cascading effect. If tin from Afghanistan or Europe couldn't reach the copper mines of Cyprus, bronze production would slow or stop. If grain shipments were intercepted, cities would starve. The intricate economic web that bound these civilizations together began to fray, piece by piece. The vibrant exchange of goods and ideas that defined the Bronze Age started to choke as safety on the seas and roads diminished. The evidence for these early troubles isn't always etched in grand monuments, but often found in the more mundane, yet telling archives of the time. Letters from various rulers and officials reveal a growing sense of anxiety. We find pleas for grain from the Hittite king to the Egyptian pharaoh, indicating severe food shortages in Anatolia. There are records of military mobilizations, suggesting increased border disputes and the need to defend against incursions. Some letters discuss the movement of troops to secure trade routes or protect vulnerable coastal settlements. These aren't the confident, boastful declarations of a secure empire, but rather the worried communications of leaders trying to manage a deteriorating situation. They talk about troubles in the land, bad harvests, and enemies at the gates. These documents give us a crucial window into the minds of those who lived through the initial phase of the collapse, showing that the great powers were acutely aware that something was wrong, even if they didn't fully grasp the scale of the impending catastrophe. The Golden Age was slowly, almost imperceptibly, tarnishing. The whispers of instability were growing louder, carrying with them the scent of change, and a new, terrifying force was about to make its dramatic entrance onto the world stage, forever altering the course of history. The whispers of instability were indeed growing louder, and soon they would be drowned out by the roar of an entirely new, disruptive force, the Sea Peoples. These enigmatic invaders burst onto the scene with a ferocity that shook the foundations of the late Bronze Age world. Their first appearances are etched into the stone records of Egypt, serving as stark warnings of the chaos to come. The Merneptah Stele, dating to around 1208 BCE, mentions a coalition of invaders, including the peoples of the sea, who had attacked Libya and Egypt. Later, the Medinet Habu Temple, built by Ramses III, provides even more vivid and detailed accounts of massive land and sea battles against these mysterious groups. These Egyptian records are crucial, as they are among the few contemporary sources that name and describe the Sea Peoples, even if the descriptions are often from the perspective of a terrified and defiant empire. But who were these Sea Peoples? This question has puzzled historians and archaeologists for decades, sparking numerous theories of their origin. Some scholars suggest they came from the Aegean, perhaps displaced Mycenaeans or other groups from the Greek mainland and islands. Others point to Anatolia, proposing they were peoples fleeing the collapsing Hittite Empire or migrating tribes from its western fringes. The truth is likely far more complex, suggesting they were not a single ethnic group, but rather a diverse coalition of peoples, united by a common purpose, or perhaps simply by the shared desperation of a world in upheaval. They were a movement, a migration, rather than a unified nation. They moved by land and by sea, bringing their families and possessions with them, indicating a permanent shift, not just a raiding party. Their impact on coastal settlements was catastrophic. Archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean bear witness to their destructive power. Cities that had thrived for centuries were suddenly razed, their populations either massacred, enslaved, or forced to flee. The Sea Peoples were ruthless and efficient. They attacked by surprise, overwhelming defenses and leaving behind a trail of burnt ruins. This wasn't just about plunder. It was about displacement, about erasing existing structures to make way for something new, or perhaps nothing at all. The very fabric of society in these coastal regions was torn apart. The Egyptian records list several names associated with these invaders, giving us a glimpse into their diverse composition. Among the most prominent were the Peliset, widely believed to be the ancestors of the Philistines, who would later settle in Canaan. Then there were the Shardana, often depicted with horned helmets, who appear in Egyptian art as both enemies and later as mercenaries in the pharaoh's army. The Luka, known from earlier Hittite records as troublesome raiders, also feature, along with the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, and the Cheka. Each name hints at a distinct group, each contributing to the overwhelming wave that crashed upon the shores of the established powers. These names, though still debated and often linked to specific regions, underscore the diverse nature of this migrating force. Their fighting style and weaponry were distinct and effective, contributing to their success against the more established, but perhaps less agile armies of the late Bronze Age. Egyptian reliefs depict the sea peoples with distinctive helmets, some feathered, others horned, setting them apart from the traditional soldiers of Egypt or the Near East. They often carried round shields, which offered good protection, and wielded straight swords, a technology that was becoming more prevalent and could pierce through bronze armor more effectively than older sickle swords. This combination of mobility, effective weaponry, and sheer numbers made them a formidable opponent, capable of overcoming the heavily fortified cities and organized armies that had dominated the region for so long. They were a force of change, a catalyst for the unraveling, and their emergence marked a definitive turning point in the unfolding Bronze Age collapse. Their arrival was not merely a series of raids. It was a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of the ancient world, heralding an era of widespread destruction and the end of an age. The great empires, already weakened by internal strife and environmental pressures, now faced an existential threat from without, one that they were ill-equipped to handle. The stage was set for a dramatic, irreversible decline. The Hittite Empire, a formidable power that had dominated Anatolia for centuries, now found itself directly in the path of this escalating chaos. For generations, the Hittites had been one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, rivaling Egypt for influence and control over the Levant. Their capital, Hattusa, was a sprawling city of monumental temples and palaces, protected by massive walls. Their archives, rich with cuneiform tablets, reveal a sophisticated bureaucracy, a complex legal system, and a history of military prowess. They had clashed with Egypt at Kadesh, signing one of the world's earliest known peace treaties, and maintained a vast network of vassal states across Anatolia and northern Syria. But even this mighty empire, seemingly unshakable, began to show signs of profound strain as the 13th century BC drew to a close. External pressures mounted from multiple directions. To their north, the Casca tribes, a perennial nuisance, grew more aggressive, constantly raiding and threatening the Hittite heartland. To the west, new groups like the Phrygians were beginning to emerge, pushing against the empire's borders. And then, of course, there were the Sea Peoples, whose destructive path was now reaching the Anatolian coastlines, disrupting trade and sowing terror. These threats were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, interconnected wave of instability that was slowly but surely eroding Hittite authority. Internally, the empire was also struggling. Successional disputes among the royal family weakened central control, leading to periods of instability. Regional governors, facing increasing local threats and dwindling support from the capital, began to assert more independence, effectively fragmenting the empire's power. This decentralization made it harder to coordinate a unified response to the external pressures. The once mighty Hittite state, built on a system of vassalage and strong central command, was fraying at the edges. Perhaps the most devastating internal weakness, however, was a series of food crises. The Hittite Empire, despite its size, was heavily reliant on agricultural output from its more fertile southern territories, and crucially, on grain imports from Egypt and other regions. Severe droughts and changing climate patterns, which were affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean, led to widespread crop failures. This meant less food for the population, and just as critically, less grain to feed their vast armies and their horses. The disruption of supply lines due to increased piracy and raiding by the Sea Peoples only made matters worse, cutting off vital imports. The empire was quite literally starving, a situation that would have ripple effects throughout its social and political structures. The final archive at Hattusa paints a grim picture of these last desperate years. Letters found among the ruins include frantic pleas for grain from the Pharaoh of Egypt, detailing the severe famine gripping the Hittite lands. Other tablets describe troop movements, not just to counter traditional enemies, but to defend against new, unidentified threats. There are records of port closures, an attempt to prevent the spread of disease, or perhaps to consolidate remaining resources. These documents reveal an empire in its death throes, struggling to maintain order and feed its people, while facing an onslaught it could barely comprehend. The language is urgent, reflecting a growing sense of panic among the ruling elite. The end of Hattusa was swift and brutal. Archaeological evidence points to a sudden and violent destruction. The city was burned, its grand buildings reduced to rubble. Unlike earlier periods of conflict where cities might be rebuilt, Hattusa was abandoned. Its ruins lay silent for centuries, a testament to the completeness of the collapse. The Hittite Empire, once a pillar of the Bronze Age world, simply ceased to exist. Its advanced writing system, cuneiform, fell out of use in Anatolia, and its complex political structure dissolved. What followed was a period of fragmentation, a dark age for Anatolia, where smaller, less sophisticated kingdoms would eventually emerge from the ashes. The fall of Hattusa was not just the collapse of a city, it was the disappearance of an entire civilization, a chilling example of how quickly even the most powerful empires could unravel under the right combination of pressures. The dominoes were falling, and the next great civilization to face a similar fate would be the Mycenaean Greeks. The Mycenaean civilization, flourishing across mainland Greece and parts of the Aegean, stood as another pinnacle of the late Bronze Age. Its palatial centers, like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, were not just royal residences but complex administrative hubs, managing vast territories through an intricate bureaucracy. They used Linear B, a syllabic script adapted from Minoan Linear A, to record everything from agricultural yields to military inventories. This was a highly organized society engaging in extensive trade across the Mediterranean, their ships carrying olive oil, wine, and finely crafted pottery to distant lands, and bringing back valuable raw materials and luxury goods. At its peak, Mycenaean Greece was a vibrant, interconnected world, a marvel of organization and artistic achievement. However, this sophisticated structure, much like the Hittite Empire, carried inherent vulnerabilities. As the pressures mounted across the eastern Mediterranean, evidence of destruction began to appear at many of these grand Mycenaean sites. Archaeological digs reveal layers of ash and rubble, indicating sudden and violent ends for powerful centers like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos. Even Knossos on Crete, though earlier impacted by events, shows signs of later disruption. The pattern of destruction suggests widespread catastrophe, not isolated skirmishes. In response to these growing threats, the Mycenaeans undertook massive defensive preparations. They reinforced their citadels with colossal cyclopean walls, so named because later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. These massive stone fortifications, like those at Mycenae, were designed to withstand sieges, featuring hidden passages, secret wells, and fortified gates. These elaborate defenses speak volumes about the perceived danger and the desperation of the times. They were not built for minor raids, but for existential threats. The structure of Mycenaean society, with its rigid hierarchy centered around the onax or king and his subjects, might have also contributed to its vulnerability. This highly centralized system, while efficient in peacetime, could become brittle under extreme stress. If the central authority faltered, the entire structure could quickly unravel. The palaces were the nerve centers, controlling resources, trade, and defense. Their destruction would leave a power vacuum, fragmenting authority and leaving local communities exposed. The common people, tied to these palatial economies, would have found their way of life completely disrupted, forced to fend for themselves in a world without central guidance. For a long time, historians pointed to the Dorian invasion theory as the primary cause of the Mycenaean collapse. This theory suggested that a group of Greek-speaking people, the Dorians, migrated from the north and violently overran the Mycenaean heartland, bringing about its downfall. While there's evidence of new populations migrating into Greece during this period, modern archaeology and linguistics have cast doubt on a single, sudden invasion being the sole cause. Instead, it's now seen as a more complex process, with internal strife, environmental changes, and the wider regional collapse all playing significant roles, perhaps exacerbated by population movements. The term Dorian invasion has largely fallen out of favor as a singular explanation, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of multiple interacting factors. The ultimate fate of Mycenaean Greece was abandonment. Many of the great palatial sites were not rebuilt. The sophisticated Linear B script tied to the palace administration vanished from use. This loss of literacy marked a profound decline in administrative capacity and intellectual life. Mass migrations occurred as people fled the devastated urban centers, seeking safety and resources in less accessible, more remote areas, or perhaps joining the tides of refugees moving across the wider Mediterranean. The complex trade networks dissolved, and the specialized crafts that had defined Mycenaean culture dwindled. What followed was a period lasting for centuries, often referred to as the Greek Dark Ages, a time characterized by smaller, more isolated communities, a simpler material culture, and a profound break from the grandeur of the Bronze Age. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece was not just the fall of a kingdom, but the unraveling of an entire way of life, demonstrating how even powerful, seemingly stable civilizations could be profoundly undone by a confluence of crises. As the great powers crumbled around it, Egypt, the ancient civilization along the Nile, found itself in a desperate fight for survival. Unlike the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, Egypt managed to hold on, but at an immense cost. The pharaohs of the new kingdom faced the onslaught of the sea peoples directly, most famously Ramses III, whose reign marked a pivotal moment in this chaotic era. His detailed accounts, carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, provide some of the most vivid and chilling descriptions of the Bronze Age collapse. These inscriptions depict a world in turmoil, with lands shattered and uprooted. Ramses III portrayed his victories as absolute and decisive, showcasing himself as the savior of Egypt. The Battle of the Delta, fought around 1175 BCE, was a colossal engagement where Egyptian forces confronted the Sea Peoples both on land and at sea. The Medinet Habu reliefs illustrate the brutal nature of this conflict. Egyptian archers raining down arrows, chariots charging, and naval battles where enemy ships were capsized and their crews slaughtered. Ramses III claimed to have utterly defeated the invaders, preventing them from establishing a foothold in Egypt. He presented these events as a triumph of Egyptian might and divine favor, a testament to his strength as pharaoh. However, the reality behind this grand propaganda was far more grim. While Ramses III did repel the immediate threat, these were Pyrrhic victories. The constant warfare had drained Egypt's treasury and manpower. The inscriptions themselves, despite their triumphant tone, reveal the sheer scale of the threat and the immense effort required to push it back. The Sea Peoples were not a single, unified army but a composite threat, a coalition of various groups like the Peleset, Denyen, Shekelesh, and Cheka, attacking from both land and sea. They were sophisticated warriors, not just disorganized raiders, and their pressure on Egypt was relentless. Even though Egypt survived the direct military invasions, the economic and political fallout was severe. The disruption of trade routes, particularly those for vital resources like tin, essential for bronze production, crippled the Egyptian economy. The intricate network of international diplomacy and commerce, which had sustained the new kingdom, had utterly collapsed. Egypt, once a dominant player on the world stage, now found itself isolated and impoverished. The cost of maintaining its army and navy, coupled with the loss of foreign revenue, led to a severe draining of its resources. Internally, Egypt began to unravel. The power of the pharaoh waned, while the influence of the high priesthood, particularly that of Amun at Thebes, grew significantly. This shift in power created internal divisions and instability. Evidence suggests widespread economic hardship, including strikes by royal workmen who sometimes went unpaid and unfed, leading to social unrest. Tomb robberies became rampant, indicative of a breakdown in law and order, and a desperate attempt by people to survive. The once unquestioned authority of the pharaoh was being challenged on multiple fronts. The period following Ramses III's reign saw a rapid decline. Subsequent pharaohs were weaker, struggling to maintain control over a vast but increasingly fragmented kingdom. The central government's authority eroded, leading to the rise of local potentates and a decline in administrative efficiency. This slow, internal decay, exacerbated by the external pressures of the Sea Peoples and the wider Bronze Age collapse, eventually led to the end of the New Kingdom and the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period. This was a long era of political fragmentation, foreign domination, and economic hardship for Egypt, a stark contrast to its imperial grandeur. So, while Egypt technically held the line against the Sea Peoples, its victory was a hollow one. It survived the immediate onslaught, but emerged from the conflict a shadow of its former self. The interconnected world that had defined the late Bronze Age was gone, and Egypt, though still standing, was left to face a new, harsher reality. The pharaohs might have boasted of their triumphs, but the long-term consequences of those battles were devastating, ushering in centuries of decline and instability. The cost of victory was almost as destructive as outright defeat, marking the end of an era for the land of the Nile. The chaos that consumed the great empires also swept through the Levant, a region that had long been a crucial crossroads of trade and culture. Here, the city of Ugarit stood as a powerful symbol of the late Bronze Age's interconnectedness. Located on the Syrian coast, Ugarit was not just a major port, it was a diplomatic hub, a wealthy trading center, and a vibrant cultural melting pot. Its archives, discovered by archaeologists, have provided invaluable insights into the final moments of this complex civilization. These clay tablets tell a story of increasing desperation, a city caught directly in the path of the approaching storm. The letters from Ugarit are heartbreaking in their urgency. They reveal a king, Amurapi, appealing to other rulers for help, describing the relentless pressure from invaders. One letter, sent to the king of Alashia, paints a vivid picture of the terror. "My father, behold, the enemy ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The king describes his own troops being sent to defend the Hittite Empire, leaving his own land vulnerable. He asks for ships and soldiers, but it seems help never arrived. The pleas are desperate, detailing attacks by sea and land, the burning of towns, and the capture of people. These weren't just distant threats, they were at Ugarit's doorstep, tearing apart the fabric of its society. The archaeological evidence from Ugarit confirms the grim narrative of the tablets. The city met a sudden and violent end. Excavations show signs of massive destruction by fire, with entire sections of the city burned to the ground. In some places, unbaked clay tablets were found still in the kilns, indicating that scribes were working right up until the moment of the attack. They didn't even have time to bake their records, a testament to the suddenness and ferocity of the assault. This wasn't a gradual decline, it was an abrupt and catastrophic collapse. The city simply ceased to be a functioning entity. Ugarit was not alone in its fate. Other Levantine cities like Emar, Kadesh and Alalak suffered similar ends. These once thriving centers of trade and administration were systematically destroyed and abandoned. The same patterns of burning, widespread destruction, and sudden cessation of activity are seen across the region. The Sea Peoples, along with other migrating groups and internal rebellions, appear to have swept through the Levant, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. The region, already a battleground for competing empires like Egypt and the Hittites, was particularly vulnerable to this new wave of instability. Adding to the region's woes was the persistent problem of drought and famine. The Levant, being a relatively arid region, was always susceptible to changes in rainfall patterns. Evidence suggests that a prolonged period of drought severely impacted agricultural output, leading to food shortages and widespread hunger. This environmental stress exacerbated existing tensions, making populations more susceptible to disease, internal unrest, and less resilient to external attacks. A weakened populace, struggling to feed itself, would have been ill-equipped to resist the organized destruction brought by the invaders. The lack of food would have made any long-term defense impossible, forcing people to abandon their homes in search of sustenance. The collapse of these Levantine cities created a power vacuum and paved the way for the emergence of new ethnic groups in the aftermath. The Philistines, one of the Sea Peoples groups, settled along the southern coast of the Levant, establishing their own distinct culture and cities, which would later feature prominently in biblical narratives. Further inland, the Aramaeans, a semi-nomadic people, began to assert their presence, eventually forming a series of small kingdoms across Syria and Mesopotamia. The old order was gone, replaced by a fragmented landscape of smaller, often competing entities. The sophisticated international system that had characterized the late Bronze Age in the Levant was utterly shattered, giving way to a period of decentralization and cultural redefinition. The destruction was so complete that it took centuries for the region to recover anything resembling its former prosperity and interconnectedness. This period marked a profound transformation, not just a temporary setback. The destruction in the Levant was not an isolated event. It was a critical part of a much larger breakdown. The interconnected web of the late Bronze Age, a system that had once fostered prosperity and innovation, was now unraveling at an alarming rate. One of the most immediate and devastating consequences of this widespread collapse was the severe disruption of trade routes. For centuries, civilizations had relied on these pathways to exchange vital resources. Tin, an essential component for making bronze, often came from distant lands like Afghanistan or even parts of Europe. Copper, another crucial metal, was largely sourced from Cyprus. When cities like Ugarit, which served as major maritime hubs, were destroyed, or when land routes through Anatolia and Syria became unsafe due to invaders and internal conflict, the flow of these materials simply stopped. Bronze Age economics were incredibly dependent on these complex supply chains. The production of bronze tools, weapons, and luxury items required a consistent and reliable supply of both tin and copper. Without these raw materials, the very foundation of the Bronze Age economy began to crumble. Imagine a modern economy losing access to oil or microchips overnight. That's the scale of the crisis these civilizations faced. The inability to produce bronze meant a decline in military strength, a halt in the creation of new tools for agriculture and construction, and a general stagnation of technological advancement. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a systemic failure that impacted every aspect of daily life. As trade routes withered, So too did the power of centralized authorities. Kings and emperors had long maintained their control through their ability to manage these trade networks, secure resources, and project military power. When they could no longer guarantee the flow of goods or protect their territories from invaders, their legitimacy and authority dwindled. No single power remained strong enough to maintain order across the vast expanse of the Near East and Aegean. The great empires, once pillars of stability, were now struggling to even protect their own capitals. This created a vacuum, allowing smaller, more localized groups to emerge, often hostile to the remnants of the old order. The sense of shared security and diplomatic cooperation that had characterized the Late Bronze Age evaporated. Treaties were broken, and alliances dissolved as each entity prioritized its own survival. This period also saw massive refugee crises. As cities were burned and agricultural lands laid waste, millions of people were displaced. They fled their homes, seeking safety and resources in regions that might still offer some semblance of stability. These mass movements of people further strained the resources of any remaining strongholds, potentially leading to additional conflicts and social unrest. Imagine hordes of desperate people arriving at the gates of a city already struggling with food shortages and internal problems. This influx would have added immense pressure, making collapse even more likely. These refugees, often armed and organized, could also become invaders themselves, contributing to the cycle of destruction as they sought new lands to settle. Historians and archaeologists often refer to this period as a system collapse or a catastrophe in slow motion. It wasn't just one factor, but a complex interplay of many different elements that led to the widespread breakdown. Climate change, which caused droughts and famine, weakened societies from within. The Sea Peoples and other migrating groups provided the external shock, destroying cities and disrupting trade. Internal rebellions further destabilized regions. All these factors fed into each other, creating a cascade effect. One failure led to another, and the entire interconnected system began to unravel. The strength of the Bronze Age had been its interconnectedness, but in a crisis, that very strength became its greatest vulnerability. When one part of the system failed, it dragged down others. One of the most profound losses during this period was the widespread loss of literacy and administrative knowledge. In many regions, particularly Mycenaean Greece and parts of Anatolia and the Levant, the complex writing systems like Linear B and various forms of cuneiform simply disappeared. The scribal schools, the administrative centers, and the palatial bureaucracies that maintained these systems were destroyed. With the collapse of centralized authority, the need for complex administration also vanished. The knowledge of reading and writing, once held by a specialized elite, was no longer passed down. This wasn't just a loss of letters, it was a loss of historical records, legal codes, economic transactions, and scientific observations. It plunged entire regions into a dark age where the ability to record and transmit complex information was severely curtailed. The sophistication of the Bronze Age, built on meticulous record-keeping, was largely forgotten, leaving future generations to rediscover or reinvent what had been lost. The world became smaller, more localized, and far less documented. The intricate web of the Bronze Age, once a testament to human ingenuity and cooperation, finally frayed and snapped under the weight of multiple pressures. While the previous parts have touched upon various aspects of this collapse, it's crucial to delve deeper into the specific theories that attempt to explain why such a powerful civilization simply vanished. One of the most compelling and increasingly accepted explanations points to a massive environmental catastrophe: climate change. Evidence for widespread drought during the Late Bronze Age is substantial and comes from various scientific disciplines. Paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, uses methods like analyzing sediment cores from lakes and oceans, stalagmites from caves, and even ancient pollen samples to reconstruct historical weather patterns. These studies consistently show a period of prolonged aridity, meaning a severe lack of rainfall across the Near East and the Aegean region, precisely when the collapse occurred. Tree ring data, collected from ancient trees whose growth patterns reflect annual climate conditions, also corroborates this picture, showing narrow growth rings indicative of drought years. Lake sediments further reveal reduced water levels and changes in vegetation, all pointing to a significantly drier climate than what these societies were accustomed to. The impact of such widespread drought on agriculture would have been devastating. Bronze Age economies were overwhelmingly agrarian, meaning they relied heavily on farming to feed their populations. Crop failures year after year would have led directly to widespread famine. Without enough food, populations would have weakened, making them more susceptible to disease and less able to defend themselves. This wasn't just a localized problem. The scale of the drought suggests it affected entire regions, crippling the ability of even the most powerful empires to feed their people. Imagine fields lying fallow, irrigation systems drying up, and granaries emptying. The stress on the population would have been immense, leading to desperation and social unrest. Beyond just food, water shortages would have affected every aspect of life. Humans need water to drink, for hygiene, and for their livestock. Animals, vital for labor, food, and transportation, would have perished in large numbers, further compounding the crisis. The lack of water would also have impacted trade, as rivers and wells, crucial for travel and sustenance, dwindled. This environmental pressure created a massive internal vulnerability, making societies less resilient to other shocks. Some researchers even link this period of drought to a larger global climate event known as the 4-2 kiloyear event. Indeed, this was a severe and sudden aridification event that occurred roughly 200 years ago, impacting many parts of the world. While the precise timing and impact on the Bronze Age collapse are still debated, the idea is that the late Bronze Age drought might have been a regional manifestation, or a prolonged aftershock of such a large-scale climate shift. Such a long-term climate change would have been beyond the control or understanding of the people living at the time, slowly but relentlessly eroding the foundations of their societies. This environmental catastrophe didn't act in isolation, of course. Instead, it exacerbated existing vulnerabilities within the Bronze Age world. Societies that were already struggling with internal political tensions, economic disparities, or external threats from raiding groups would have found themselves pushed past their breaking point by prolonged drought and famine. A state that could barely feed its own people would have little capacity to maintain a standing army, repair infrastructure, or engage in complex diplomacy. The interconnectedness that once brought prosperity now meant that a climate crisis in one region could quickly ripple outwards, affecting trade partners and allies who relied on their goods or resources. The climate didn't just cause the collapse, but it acted as a powerful accelerant, turning existing problems into insurmountable crises. It was a silent, relentless enemy that slowly starved and weakened the very fabric of civilization, paving the way for other factors to deliver the final blow. The environmental pressures, while immense, were not the only forces at play. Another theory, gaining traction among archaeologists, points to a period of intense seismic activity, often called an earthquake storm. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on a complex network of fault lines, and large earthquakes have always been a part of its geological history. However, some researchers suggest that the late Bronze Age experienced a cluster of particularly powerful tremors, occurring relatively close together in time. Evidence for this earthquake storm comes from the widespread destruction layers found at many major Bronze Age sites. Cities like Mycenae, Tiryns, Hattusa, and Ugarit all show signs of sudden, catastrophic damage that could be attributed to earthquakes. Walls toppled, buildings collapsed, and pottery was shattered in ways consistent with seismic events. While a single earthquake might be devastating locally, a series of them could cripple an entire region, especially if they hit important administrative centers or trade hubs. Imagine a society already weakened by drought, then repeatedly hit by natural disasters that destroy infrastructure, displace populations, and kill large numbers of people. Rebuilding efforts would have been constant, draining resources and morale. The psychological toll alone would have been immense, as people struggled to understand why their world was literally shaking apart. This theory doesn't replace other explanations, but rather adds another layer of stress and disruption to an already fragile system. The structural damage would have made cities vulnerable to invaders. As defensive walls crumbled and watchtowers fell, it would have disrupted daily life, agriculture, and communication, making it harder for centralized authorities to respond effectively to other threats. Alongside these natural calamities, a significant technological shift was quietly brewing: the Iron Revolution. For centuries, bronze had been the dominant metal. It was strong, durable, and could be cast into intricate tools and weapons. But bronze had a major drawback. Its components, copper and tin, were not always readily available. Tin, in particular, was a rare commodity, often sourced from distant lands like Afghanistan or even Cornwall in Britain, requiring complex and vulnerable trade networks to reach the Mediterranean. The disruption of these trade routes, caused by factors like the Sea People's raids or the collapse of centralized empires, would have made tin incredibly scarce and expensive. Without tin, bronze production would have ground to a halt. This scarcity created an opening for iron. Iron ore was far more common, found in many regions, including within the Mediterranean itself. However, iron was much harder to work. It couldn't be melted and cast like bronze. Instead, it required intense heat and repeated hammering, a process called smithing, to remove impurities and shape it into usable forms. For a long time, early iron was inferior to bronze, brittle and difficult to manage. But slowly, over centuries, smiths perfected their techniques. They learned how to carburize iron, introducing carbon to create steel, a much stronger and more durable material. As the Bronze Age drew to a close and tin became harder to acquire, iron started to become a viable alternative. Initially, it might have been seen as a poor substitute, but its accessibility was its greatest advantage. This democratization of weaponry had profound implications. Bronze weapons and tools were expensive, requiring specialized knowledge and access to rare materials, meaning they were largely the preserve of elites, kings, nobles, and their standing armies. Iron, being more abundant, could be produced locally by smaller communities. This meant that even common folk could potentially acquire iron tools for farming or iron weapons for defense, shifting the balance of power. The impact of this technological change on social hierarchies was immense. The elite's control over bronze production was a key source of their power and wealth. They controlled the mines, the trade routes, and the skilled artisans. When iron became the new dominant metal, this control was eroded. New centers of power could emerge where iron ore was plentiful and smithing techniques were mastered. It also meant that smaller, less centralized groups, who might not have had access to the elaborate bronze trade networks, could now equip themselves with effective weapons. This could have contributed to the rise of new, more decentralized political structures and the decline of the large, palace-based economies that characterized the late Bronze Age. The shift from bronze to iron wasn't just about a new material. It was about a fundamental change in the economic, social, and military landscape, further undermining the old order and paving the way for a new era. The combination of earthquakes shaking cities apart and the silent revolution of iron changing the very nature of power created an environment ripe for radical transformation. The changes brought by iron, combined with environmental disasters and seismic activity, created a perfect storm. But the internal workings of these societies also played a huge role. We're talking about societal breakdown, problems from within that weakened them long before any external threat delivered the final blow. Think of it like a house with a shaky foundation. Even if a strong wind comes along, the house was already unstable. One major factor was internal strife. The elaborate Bronze Age societies, with their kings, priests, and complex bureaucracies, often relied on a rigid social structure. At the top were the elites, who enjoyed vast wealth and power, controlling trade, resources, and often the lives of common people. Below them were the vast majority, farmers, laborers, and even slaves. Economic inequality was rampant. The palaces accumulated immense riches, while many people struggled. When times were good, this system could hold together, but when crises hit, like droughts, famines, or disruptions in trade, the cracks would show. Imagine a kingdom where the king lives in luxury, surrounded by gold and exotic goods, while his people are starving because the harvest failed for the third year in a row. How long until their loyalty wavers? Historical records, even those from the Bronze Age, hint at peasant revolts and slave uprisings, though they are often downplayed or erased by the official narrative. These internal pressures, whether they manifested as outright rebellion or just widespread discontent, would have made these societies incredibly vulnerable. A population that feels exploited or neglected by its rulers is less likely to fight for them when invaders arrive or when resources become scarce. Their will to resist would have been eroded from the inside. This idea of an internal breakdown, amplified by external threats, leads us to the systems collapse model. This theory suggests that the late Bronze Age world was a highly interconnected network of states. They relied on each other for trade, for military alliances, and even for cultural exchange. When one part of this system began to fail, it had a ripple effect, causing other parts to falter. It's like a row of dominoes. If you knock down one, the others fall in sequence. For example, if the Hittite Empire, a major power, started to weaken due to internal problems and external pressures, its trade routes would become less secure. This would impact the Mycenaean Greeks, who might rely on Hittite territories for certain goods. If the Mycenaean palaces then faced their own internal issues, perhaps a peasant revolt fueled by famine, they would be less able to send aid or maintain their end of the trade agreements. This breakdown in diplomatic relations, the abandonment of treaties, and the loss of trust between states would have accelerated the collapse. Each failure made the next one more likely. When centralized authority crumbled, what was left? Often it was a power vacuum. The powerful kings and emperors who once commanded vast armies and managed complex economies were gone. In their place, local warlords and fragmented power structures emerged. These smaller entities might have been better equipped to survive in a chaotic world, focusing on local defense and self-sufficiency, but they lacked the capacity to maintain the large-scale infrastructure, trade networks, and diplomatic ties that defined the Bronze Age. The complex administration, the scribes keeping meticulous records, the long-distance exchange of goods, all of it broke down. This loss of complexity is a key characteristic of what we call Dark Ages. It's not just an absence of light in a metaphorical sense, but a literal decline in the sophistication of societies. Writing systems like Linear B in Mycenaean Greece disappeared. Monumental architecture became rare. Art forms simplified. Large, organized states were replaced by smaller, more isolated communities. This wasn't necessarily a period of utter despair for everyone. But it was a period of greatly reduced complexity, a significant step backward from the interconnected, technologically advanced world that came before. The knowledge and skills accumulated over centuries were lost or forgotten in many regions, plunging societies into an era of more localized, simpler existence. The Bronze Age collapse was therefore not just about invaders or earthquakes. It was also about the inability of these complex, centralized systems to adapt to multiple, simultaneous stresses, leading to a profound internal unraveling that reshaped the ancient world. The Bronze Age collapse, while devastating, wasn't the end of everything. It was a period of intense transformation, a kind of forced reset that eventually led to new ways of life and the emergence of new societies. The Dark Ages that followed weren't just about destruction and loss. They were also a crucible where new political entities, cultures, and technologies were forged. From the ashes of the old world, a new one began to take shape, sometimes slowly, sometimes with surprising speed. One of the most prominent groups to emerge in the aftermath were the Philistines. We know them primarily from biblical accounts, often as the arch-enemies of the early Israelites, but archaeology tells a more nuanced story. The Philistines settled in Canaan, along the southern coast, in cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Their pottery, architecture, and burial customs show clear connections to Aegean cultures, particularly Mycenaean Greece and Cyprus. This evidence strongly suggests that they were indeed among the sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records, settling down after their migrations and conflicts. They brought with them new technologies, like ironworking, and a distinct culture that influenced the region. Their unique blend of local Canaanite and Aegean traditions created a vibrant, if often warlike, society. They were not just invaders, they were settlers who adapted to their new environment and contributed to the diverse tapestry of the Iron Age Levant. Another significant group that rose to prominence after the collapse were the Aramaeans. These semi-nomadic peoples, speaking an Aramaic language, spread across the Near East, from Syria to Mesopotamia. Their language, Aramaic, would eventually become a lingua franca, spoken across vast empires and even by Jesus Christ centuries later. The Aramaeans established numerous small kingdoms like Aram Damascus and Bit Agusi, filling the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the weakening of Assyria. They were skilled traders and pastoralists, and their presence marked a shift from the large, centralized empires of the Bronze Age to a mosaic of smaller, more localized states. Their influence was profound, both culturally and linguistically, shaping the future of the region for millennia. Then there were the Phoenicians, inhabitants of the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon, like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. While their cities had existed during the Bronze Age, the collapse freed them from the dominance of larger empires like Egypt and the Hittites. With the old trade routes disrupted, the Phoenicians, skilled sailors and merchants, seized the opportunity to create new ones. They developed an extensive maritime trade network across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies and trading posts as far west as Spain and North Africa. Their most lasting contribution, however, was the development of the Phoenician alphabet. This simple phonetic writing system, derived from earlier Semitic scripts, was far easier to learn than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphics. It traveled with their trade goods and was eventually adopted and adapted by the Greeks, becoming the ancestor of nearly all modern alphabets. This innovation was a direct response to the need for easier communication in a world without the elaborate scribal traditions of the Bronze Age. Even in Greece, where the collapse was particularly severe, leading to the loss of literacy and the abandonment of palaces, a new world slowly emerged. The so-called Greek Dark Ages were a period of depopulation and reduced material culture. But they were also a time of significant social and political restructuring. The centralized palatial system of the Mycenaeans was gone, replaced by smaller, more independent communities. Over centuries, these communities would evolve into the city-states, or poleis, that would define classical Greece. The memory of the Mycenaean past, though distorted, lived on in oral traditions, eventually codified in the Homeric epics. Crucially, the Greeks eventually re-adopted writing, but this time they used the Phoenician alphabet, adapting it to their own language and adding vowels. This new Greek alphabet was much more flexible and accessible than Linear B, paving the way for the explosion of literature, philosophy, and democracy that would characterize ancient Greece. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse were not just those who physically endured. They were also the cultures and societies that found new ways to organize, to trade, and to communicate. They adapted to a world without the grand empires and complex interdependencies that had defined the preceding centuries. The period immediately following the collapse was undoubtedly difficult, marked by hardship and uncertainty, but it also fostered innovation and resilience. It was a time when localized solutions replaced universal systems, when smaller, more agile entities could thrive where monolithic empires had failed. The world that emerged from this chaos was different, perhaps less opulent in some ways, but it was also a world ripe for new forms of human organization and cultural expression, laying the groundwork for the Iron Age and the civilizations that would follow. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not merely a tale of destruction. It is a profound lesson in the fragility of complex systems. When we look at the intricate web of trade, diplomacy, and resource dependency that characterized the late Bronze Age, we see parallels to our own interconnected world. A single point of failure, whether it was a drought, a conflict, or a supply chain disruption, could trigger a cascade effect across vast regions. The reliance on tin from distant mines, for instance, meant that political instability or natural disaster in one area could cripple bronze production thousands of miles away. This highlights how an over-specialized global economy, while efficient in good times, becomes incredibly vulnerable when conditions turn sour. The collapse teaches us that interconnectedness, while a source of strength and prosperity, can also be a profound weakness, amplifying shocks and making recovery much harder. One of the most striking lessons from the dust of the Bronze Age is the undeniable role of climate change in societal collapse. While ancient peoples did not have the scientific understanding we do today, the evidence of widespread drought and climate shifts is compelling. Prolonged periods of reduced rainfall led to crop failures, which in turn caused famine and widespread hunger. This put immense stress on populations, leading to internal unrest, migrations, and increased competition for dwindling resources. Even powerful empires like the Hittites, with their sophisticated administration, were brought to their knees by the inability to feed their people. This historical example serves as a stark reminder of how deeply human civilization is tied to environmental stability and how even advanced societies can buckle under the weight of ecological pressures. It underscores the critical importance of understanding and managing our environment, especially as we face similar challenges today. Another crucial takeaway is the importance of resource management and diversification. The Bronze Age economies were heavily invested in bronze, a material that required two specific metals, copper and tin, sourced from often disparate and distant locations. When these supply lines broke down, the entire technological and military foundation of these societies was undermined. The eventual shift to iron, a more abundant and locally available metal, was not just a technological upgrade, it was a move towards greater resilience. Societies that could adapt and find alternative resources, or those that were less reliant on a single, vulnerable supply chain, had a better chance of weathering the storm. This speaks to the need for flexibility and variety in our own resource strategies, avoiding over-reliance on any single commodity or source. The impact of mass migrations and displaced populations is also a central theme in the collapse narrative. The Sea Peoples, whatever their exact origins, represented a massive movement of people, likely driven by their own displacement and desperation. Their arrival destabilized existing political structures and contributed to the widespread destruction of cities. But beyond direct invasion, the famine and unrest caused by climate change also forced many people to leave their homes in search of food and safety. These movements created immense pressure on host regions, leading to conflicts and further societal breakdown. The Bronze Age collapse shows us how mass displacement, whether due to environmental factors or conflict, can have profound and lasting consequences for entire regions, reshaping demographics and creating new cultural landscapes. Looking at the rise and fall of these ancient civilizations, one cannot help but notice the cyclical nature of history. Empires rise, grow powerful, establish complex systems, and then, for a variety of reasons, decline and fall. The Bronze Age was a period of unprecedented advancement and globalism for its time, yet it ultimately proved unsustainable. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history, from Rome to various modern empires. While no two collapses are identical, the underlying principles often remain similar: the interplay of internal pressures, external threats, environmental changes, and the inherent vulnerabilities of complex systems. Studying these cycles can offer valuable insights into the dynamics of power, stability, and change in human societies. Finally, the Bronze Age collapse highlights the dangers of over-specialization and a lack of resilience. The highly centralized palatial economies of the Mycenaeans, for example, were incredibly efficient at managing resources and labor during times of peace. However, their rigidity and reliance on a single administrative structure made them brittle. When the system was disrupted, there was little capacity for adaptation at the local level. The loss of the scribal class meant the loss of the entire administrative memory in many places. In contrast, the more decentralized societies that emerged later, though perhaps less grand, were often more adaptable and resilient to shocks. They could respond to local conditions without waiting for directives from a distant central authority. This teaches us that while efficiency is good, it must be balanced with flexibility and the ability to withstand unexpected challenges. The Bronze Age collapse is a powerful reminder that even the most advanced and interconnected civilizations are not immune to profound and rapid transformation, and that understanding the past can offer critical perspectives on the present and future. The Bronze Age collapse, a period spanning roughly from 1200 to 1150 BCE, was not a single event, but a complex series of interconnected crises that brought an end to a flourishing era of human history. We have explored the various threads that contributed to this unraveling. Environmental shifts like prolonged droughts that crippled agriculture and led to widespread famine. The disruptive movements of diverse groups, often labeled as the Sea Peoples. Internal strife fueled by economic disparities and rigid social structures. And the inherent fragility of highly centralized interconnected systems. Each of these factors played a role, sometimes acting in concert, sometimes independently, to dismantle the sophisticated civilizations that had defined the late Bronze Age. It wasn't just one cause, but a perfect storm of challenges that overwhelmed societies unprepared for such a cascade of failures. The collapse was a harsh lesson in the vulnerability of complex systems, showing how an interconnected world, while offering great benefits, also carries the risk of a domino effect when one part fails. The profound shift from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age stands as the most tangible legacy of this collapse. Before the collapse, bronze was the dominant metal for tools, weapons, and prestige objects. Its production relied on a delicate and extensive trade network to acquire copper and tin, often from distant lands. When these networks broke down, bronze became scarce, expensive, and eventually almost impossible to obtain for many regions. This scarcity forced people to innovate, leading to the widespread adoption of iron. Iron, though initially harder to work, was far more abundant and locally sourced in many areas. This shift democratized tool and weapon production, as it was no longer controlled by an elite who managed the bronze trade. The Iron Age brought about new forms of warfare, new agricultural tools, and ultimately a different kind of society, one less dependent on long-distance trade for its basic needs. It was a technological revolution born out of necessity, fundamentally altering the course of human development. The period immediately following the collapse, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was not merely an absence of light, but a profound reset of civilization. Many sophisticated elements of the Bronze Age vanished. Writing systems like Linear B in Mycenaean Greece disappeared, leading to centuries of illiteracy. Monumental construction ceased, administrative centers were abandoned, and populations scattered. Knowledge was lost, trade routes dried up, and a more localized, less complex way of life emerged. Yet, this darkness also contained the seeds of new beginnings. The destruction of old power structures allowed for the emergence of new political entities, often smaller and more adaptable. Communities that survived had to rebuild, innovate, and find new ways to organize themselves. This period of contraction ultimately paved the way for the vibrant and diverse Iron Age societies that would follow. From these ashes, the world that would become classical antiquity began to take shape. In Greece, after centuries of illiteracy, a new alphabet emerged, adapting the Phoenician script. This new alphabet was simpler than Linear B and more accessible, contributing to a broader spread of literacy and the eventual flowering of Greek literature and philosophy. In the Levant, new peoples like the Philistines, Aramaeans, and Phoenicians established distinct cultures and kingdoms. The Phoenicians, masters of the sea, revitalized trade with their innovative ships and established colonies across the Mediterranean, spreading their alphabet and cultural influence. In Anatolia, the Hittite legacy was picked up by smaller Neo-Hittite states, while new groups like the Phrygians rose to prominence. Even Egypt, though weakened, eventually entered a new phase of its long history. The collapse, while devastating, cleared the ground for new cultural and political landscapes that would define the next millennia. The enduring mystery of the Bronze Age collapse continues to fascinate and challenge historians and archaeologists today. Despite decades of research, no single universally accepted explanation fully accounts for its scale and speed. The interplay of climate change, migration, internal unrest, and systemic fragility remains a subject of ongoing debate. This enduring mystery highlights the inherent power of the unknown in history, how seemingly stable and advanced societies can be brought to their knees by forces that are not always easy to pinpoint or fully understand. It serves as a constant reminder that our understanding of the past is always evolving, and that history is rarely as simple as a single cause and effect. Ultimately, the story of the Bronze Age collapse is also a testament to the resilience and adaptability of humanity. Despite the widespread destruction, the loss of knowledge, and the profound societal upheaval, people survived. They rebuilt, they innovated, and they adapted to a radically changed world. New societies emerged, often stronger and more resilient in their new forms. The collapse, while a period of immense suffering and loss, was not the end of civilization, but a transformative chapter that reshaped it in fundamental ways. It shows that even in the face of catastrophic breakdown, the human spirit finds a way to endure, to to learn, and to forge a new path forward. The Bronze Age collapse is a powerful historical mirror, reflecting not just the fragility of complex systems, but also the remarkable capacity of humanity to overcome adversity and embark on new beginnings.